Hi, everyone. This is Alessandra Torre with Authors AI, and this is First Draft Friday. We are back from our summer hiatus, and I am so happy today to be chatting about story outlines with Stefan. So, Stefan, welcome to the show. It's great to have you. And today we're going to be chatting about origins of story outline, but also just a brief kind of overview and walkthrough of what makes a great outline. So without further ado, do you want to introduce yourself to the audience and give a little bit of your history?
Sure. First, thank you for having me. My name is Stefan Emunds. That's a German name, and I'm a visionary fiction author. So fiction stories with an enlightenment component. The most famous visionary fiction novel is The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. Yeah. So, but I also wrote a book about writing, which is called The 8 Crafts of Writing. And there is a little story behind it. So 5 years into my writing journey, I felt a bit lost in the weeds. I had learned a lot, but I did not have the overview of the writing crafts. And I felt like lost in the mountains. You know, I climbed one mountain, learn a craft or a skill, just to find out there's another mountain waiting for me. So at one point, I was so upset with the situation that I stopped writing and said, okay, now I need to get myself an overview about everything I need to learn. So I know how many mountains I still have to climb. And when I was done with that, I realized, many other authors probably want the same thing. So that's how I came to write The 8 Crafts of Writing.
That's fantastic. So, to recap, he writes visionary fiction, and a lot of the crafts you were talking about were actual, like the art of writing, so different elements of a story, and that's what you kept stumbling about and then would need to learn more about. I think that's why a lot of new authors quit, because they don't know how much is left for them to learn, and it just feels overwhelming. So
exactly.
So today we're talking about story origins. So can you explain or talk a little bit about the origin of story outline?
Okay. So the origin of story outline is the adversity cycle. When I was writing my stories, I used the hero's journey a lot, and it borrows itself to visionary fiction, because many visionary fiction stories are actually journeys, like The Alchemist. But there were things about the hero's journey that always felt a bit weird to me. And I could use it as a template, but there are parts which I couldn't fully understand. So, for example, the approaching of the cave. I mean, the ordeal in the cave is pretty straightforward. That's the midpoint where the protagonist acquires the key ability, the sword, in order to vanquish the antagonist. But why is the approach of the cave, which is a phase, not a milestone, why is that so important? And I asked around, but nobody could explain that to me. Yeah. And another thing was the elixir. Yeah, the return was the elixir. Is the elixir the same thing as the sword? And if it's the same thing, why suddenly it's called different? And last but not least, the hero's journey does not foresee a climax. So you always have to combine it with, for example, the 3-act, 7 plot point structure, for example. Yeah. And I don't know if it happened to you, but sometimes I read a story or watched a movie where the writer used the hero's journey, but it didn't feel natural. And I could see the writer at work. So at one point, I wanted to get to the bottom of what was bothering me. So I thought about it very carefully, and I realized that I felt it's unnatural. So I asked myself, what is natural? And that was the right question to ask. Yeah? And the answer for that question led me to a new definition of story and the discovery of the adversity cycle. Yeah. So what are stories? Stories are reflections of life. And life is a string of experiences. Everything that happens in our life, we experience. What happens to us, things that happens outside of us, or thoughts, feelings, emotions that happen inside of us, we always experience those. Yeah. So life and experience is the same thing. And stories are then virtual experiences. Yeah. But not all experiences can make it into a story. In real life, we have good and bad times, good and bad stories. But in stories, it's only always bad stories. Yeah, there must be some kind of adversity, or it's not a story. It will only be an anecdote.
That's a good point.
Yeah, for example, if you tell your friends about your last vacation, that's an anecdote. But if somebody mugged you while you were in a vacation, you have a story to tell. Yeah.
Yeah.
So no adversity, no story. So therefore, I define stories as virtual adventures, and adventures are, hopefully inspiring struggles with adversity. So then I ask myself, okay, so how do we face adversity then in real life? And turns out there is something like an adversity cycle we go through every time we face a new type of adversity. And I think best is if I explain that cycle with an example. Is that okay?
Absolutely. And for those of you listening, first of all, don't be shy. Feel free to pop any questions that you have into the comment section. If you RSVP'd for this event, I did email out this morning a copy to a handout. It's really fantastic, and it will follow along closely with a lot of what we're talking about. So if you missed that handout download, we'll also pop it here into chat. But I encourage you to download that. And also, obviously, to dive in deeper, you can check out Stefan's book, which is, I'm assuming information is at 8crafts.com. So yeah, please, if you have an example, that would be great.
Yeah, the example and the explanation is also in the handout. And I will just recap that here quickly. So adversity makes itself felt in our life first through symptoms. So there's Pete, who is a computer programmer and a gamer, and he neglects apartment maintenance. And one day his kitchen sink is dripping, and he's gaming, and he's busy and lazy, so he ignores it. Yeah. So, but of course, adversity, the symptoms worsen, and then the dripping starts getting annoying. So the annoyance is the second phase. So what we usually do when something annoys us, we try to do a quick fix or a quick workaround. In this case, Pete, he tapes the pipe below the sink, and for a while it stops dripping, but after a while it starts dripping again, and symptoms worsen again, and it starts leaking, and the kitchen floor floods. So now something is at stake. Yeah, so that's the next stage. Something is at stake, and that forces Pete to go into an introspection. So he changes from subjective reaction to symptoms to an active analysis of the root cause of the problem, of the adversity. So he goes to Google, he goes to YouTube, checks out some plumbing videos, and then he takes apart the pipe. Turns out the culprit is a worn-out rubber washer. He replaces that and puts the pipe back together, and the problem is solved. And not only is the problem solved, but he now knows plumbing. So next time a pipe leaks, it's not going to be an adventure anymore. Yeah, he will fix it in no time and without any tension and stress and frustration. Yeah, so that's the adversity cycle. And how do we get from the adversity to the story cycle is by adding dramatic devices. Yeah. So I imagine that in the early days, when our ancestors still dwelled in cave, they would tell at the bonfire, they would tell real life adventures they had. Yeah. Killing a mammoth, or escaping a tiger, or kidnapping a woman from a neighbor clan, things like that. And as storytelling evolved, they added dramatic devices to, embellish the stories. Yeah. And when the Greek came, they then lifted the storytelling to a art form. Yeah, the first time books appeared and the great Greek theaters appeared, so it became an art form and took a life on its own. So I believe when Joseph Campbell, who wrote The Hero's Journey, what he did is he analyzed hundreds of stories, and what he did is he extracted the dramatic devices and put them into a sequence, and that became The Hero's Journey. But he lost the adversity cycle on the way. Yeah, so that's then the reason why sometimes if a writer applies the hero's journey without knowing the adversity cycle, it feels unnatural. Yeah.
So if I understand correctly, so first of all, when was the hero's journey created? Like what time frame?
That's like 100 years ago or 80 years ago.
Okay.
By Joseph Campbell. Yeah. And then came Christoph Vogler, that was like 50 years ago, with a simplified version of it.
So, so you have a story, you have adversity, which is typically, and I don't know if we have time to go through the path of that, but you have adversity, and then you're also adding in the realistic elements, which is what we were talking about there. So, and how that, and I love that real life example because it is very true. I will avoid everything until it's an issue, and then and then, but it can be applied to so many more things, not just a dripping sink. It can be a problem in your relationship, or
or workarounds. Yeah, I mean, workarounds are actually big business. Yeah, so I mean, I don't want to say anything bad about pharma industry, but they sell a lot of workarounds instead of solutions to sicknesses. For example, blood pressure medicine. It just suppresses the symptoms, and you will have to take them for the rest of their life. And it doesn't do anything against the blood pressure. So the workaround seems a bit of a small thing in story, but actually it is in real life. It's actually a big thing, workarounds.
I love that. So how do you get so you have the adversity cycle and the story cycle, and you get between the two with dramatic elements? Is that correct? Or is there
dramatic elements or dramatic devices? For example, the midpoint, when the protagonist acquires the key ability to vanquish the antagonist, that's very real to life, because we always face to get to the bottom of the problem at one point. Yeah. But the all is lost moment, for example, at the 75% mark, that's very dramatic. And all is lost moments happen very rare in life, but almost every time in stories. Yeah, so that would be an example for a dramatic device.
That's a great point. Yeah. So if I'm a new author and I'm writing my story and it feels flat, or I've followed this, a typical story outline, but it just doesn't seem to have a lot of life, I need to add more dramatic elements. Is that a suggestion that you would have? Heighten the stakes?
Yeah. There's this balance between real to life and drama. Yeah. You can go wrong on both sides. So you can have too much drama. That's then melodrama. You can have not enough drama. So then there will be not enough tension or curiosity. But you also can be false to life. Yeah. For example, if you get something, if your story arc feels unnatural, like I notice it sometimes, the best way is you go back to the adversity cycle and use that to analyze where it is unnatural. Yeah, for example, maybe you're already in the stake phase, but then you still show some symptoms, which then gets boring because you're already, in the stake phase, in the solution phase, and you're already soaring towards the climax. Then you shouldn't come back to symptoms and things like that.
That also solves, I think, a problem. A lot of, especially new authors, like the solutions are too easy, right? Like it's just suddenly, there's a problem and then there's magically, whatever item you need right there to fix it. So when you're writing your story, are these adversity cycles like throughout it? Like there might be 4 or 5 in a novel, or the adversity cycle is part of a giant, like if this is your outline, the adversity cycle this in the build up, where I'm trying to picture it whether adversity cycles are small mini solutions to, or if they're a bigger part of the story.
Okay, there's always one major adversity cycle, and that's the story arc, which is then gilded with dramatic devices, which, for example, you can take from the hero's journey. So you have a mix between the adversity cycle and the hero's journey, and that spans over your whole story. But you can also use the adversity cycle for a scene. Yeah, so let's say the protagonist, something happens in the life of in the situation the protagonist is in, and he's faced with a new type of adversity. Yeah, you can use the adversity cycle to get the protagonist through the scene in a natural way.
Yeah, I think that's great. So what are some of the advantages of or benefits of using an adversity cycle?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, now it's very easy to distinguish between what is real to life and what is dramatic device or what is drama. Yeah, and if your story arcs feels unnatural, yeah, you can use the adversity cycle to analyze what went wrong or what is misplaced. I believe one can also use the adversity cycle as a minimum plot outline. Yeah, so you take the phases, symptoms, annoyance, stake, and key ability, finding the key ability, plus the obligatory scenes of your genre. Yeah, so in romance, it's the happily ever after. And then you have a minimum, you have your key scenes, which become then the skeleton of your story outline. And you can also use the adversity cycle to analyze variations of story outline and understand why they work. So, for example, in action stories, the writer jumps right into the stake phase. So he skips all the symptoms and the annoyance and things like that. He puts life and death at stake. And that, action stories need to do that, but that causes a problem because in the story, you need to keep raising the stakes to keep the reader engaged, or your attention will drop. And once you put life and death at stake, there are not many options of raising the stakes.
Yeah.
So there's maybe somebody's life is at stake, then the protagonist's life is at stake, then his lover's life is at stake, or his community is at stake, or the country, or the earth, the planet, or universe. Yeah, and that's the reason why many action stories, for example, James Bond, they always end up with mankind at stake. Yeah, because you run out of options to raise the stakes.
Wow. Yeah. That's really interesting. Yeah, I've never even thought about that, but you're right. Like an action story does, when I look back at action stories, that's a great point.
Yeah, they run out of stakes. Yeah. Yeah. But on the other side, if you watch or read disaster movies or horror movies, they like to start with the symptoms. So they let the little symptoms pop up here and there, and let different characters notice them. So it's very difficult for the characters to connect the dots, and only if they come together, they then suddenly realize what's going on. And the Netflix series who's doing this very well is Stranger Things. And it's, I didn't count it, but I believe it's always the 4th or 5th episode of every season where then all the different small groups or characters come together, and they're like, oh, this happened to me, and this happened to me. And then everybody realizes what's going on. Yeah, so that's then.
That's interesting. Yeah, so it's like different story threads, but they needed to all compare their stories.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I also find is a little bit funny is superhero stories. So in real life, first we face adversity, and then we try to find the key ability to solve it. In superhero stories, the key ability drops into the lap of the protagonist at the beginning of the story. And that's usually the inciting incident. I forgot the first name. Parker gets bitten by the spider, and then he gets Spider-Man. And so he gets the key ability first, and then he tries to find someone to use it on, an adversity or antagonist. So it's exactly the opposite as in real life, but it works.
I'm trying to think about romance and how like a romance, romance oftentimes starts kind of all happy and cheery, you know, and then the, you know, the stakes get higher as, and that is very much like your adversity cycle example is great, where like it's there's little things that you might overlook, and then they start to become bigger and bigger problems until
like in a relationship, you know, first everything is nice, and then the symptoms start popping up until they have to face the issue, you know, whatever it is in a romance.
At first, you don't mind the dirty clothes on the floor, and then they start getting worse and worse. Yeah, absolutely. That's great. I really like your application across the different genres. I'm trying to think if there are, and mysteries, I would think is the same like Stranger Things, where it a little bit more and more as you get more and more clues, they start unfolding. So what about in your genre as a visionary? It's more the slow, gradual. If you're on a journey, how does that normally unfold?
Okay, that depends, because visionary fiction is actually not an external genre like thriller or romance. It's an internal genre, because it's all about the expansion of consciousness or revelation, or one learns something one cannot learn in school, things like that. So you can actually write visionary fiction in any kind of external genre. You can write a thriller, you can write a romance, or you can write an adventure story, like in the case of The Alchemist. That's actually an adventure. He's going on a journey to find a treasure. Yeah, so that's an adventure. Now, I have to say, in these kind of stories, like adventure stories, protagonistic forces prevail. Yeah, and adversity is a little bit on the sideline in this kind of stories. So you need to keep that in mind. So if you have an antagonistic story, or a story where antagonistic forces prevail, yeah, you have the adversity bursting into somebody's life and creating the symptoms, and, you know, unraveling more and more. But if you have a protagonistic story like adventure, and maybe also romance, it's more like an exciting story. Yeah, and adversity, yeah, it shows up later on a little bit, yeah, around in the, I would say, in the second or third act, and just, you know, making the life for the protagonist a little bit difficult, but it never gets to, you know, life and death stakes and things like that. So you need to keep that in mind.
And in your hand, so talking about antagonist, in your handout, you talk about how adversity and antagonist are not the same thing. Can you dive in a little deeper to how they work together?
Okay, yeah, that's actually, I believe, a very important thing to consider. So the way I think about adversity is it applies to everybody in the story. And adversity is a forceful power or thing that unravels. As long as nobody opposes it, it will fully unravel and take over whatever it wants to take over. So the protagonist is the one who opposes this unraveling power, and the antagonist is the one who profits from the adversity and try to catalyze it. Thinking of an example. Yeah, the other day I rewatched No Time. I don't know if you know that. That's a movie, science fiction, where time becomes the currency. And if you run out of, there's like a clock in your body, and if you run out of time, you'll die. Yeah, so everybody pays with time. And the protagonist is somebody who helps people to survive. Yeah, borrows time here or finds time, and it gives it to them so they can live a bit longer. And most of them live from day to day. But the antagonist is somebody who actually profits from this, and he accumulates a lot of time for himself. So the others are in this dire need, and he can then control the poor sections of society. So the protagonist opposes adversity, and the antagonist catalyzes adversity because he profits from it. And if you want to find if you don't have an antagonist, and if you don't find one, think about the workarounds. Yeah. So if you have an adversity and people are applying workarounds for this adversity, so who could profit from workarounds, and that's usually then an antagonist. That's how you can find your antagonist.
I love that. Yeah, I like that a lot. Who can profit from workarounds? Yeah. So whose benefit is it for this not to be solved, for this problem not to be solved because they're profiting from the workarounds? Yeah, I like that. We're almost out of time. If anybody has questions, now's the time to shout them out. We did have someone on Facebook who said a modern and approachable presentation of the hero's journey is the book Take Off Your Pants by Libby Hawker. I don't know if you've read that, Stefan, but that does kind of lead into the last question I was going to ask you, which is how does the adversity cycle compare to story outline methods like the hero's journey? Is it adding the realistic component? Are there any other story outline methods that you wanted to mention that you studied when creating this?
Yeah, I mean, the only story outline methods I worked with was the hero's journey, then the 7 plot points, 3 act structure, and the 5 commandments from StoryGrid. But again, if you use these methodologies, you can always end up with a story arc that doesn't feel natural. So the adversity cycle is always a fallback.
Yeah, it's like reality.
That's what we want to do. We want to write real to life, right? So we always need to think, okay, what is real to life? What is real to life? Like that. And that's what the adversity cycle does for you.
Yeah, because even in fantasy books, you still have the real to life component of the character. We are human. I mean, even if we're not human, we think like humans. So we have the decision making and abilities, but also bad traits like putting off a problem until we have to solve it, especially if you're doing other things and battling other forces and, it's trying to stay alive. I'm really interested by that No Time. I'm going to have to watch. It's a movie, you said? Yeah,
it's a movie. No Time.
It sounds fascinating, and I'm curious if it came from a book.
It's a great setup.
But yeah, it's a fantastic concept. So I'm going to have to watch that to see how they told that story. But in wrapping up, how can people follow you? Your book is not yet out. Your visionary books, they can't read that. But we did have a question. William asked, first of all, is it No Time or In Time? Do you know? I think someone's
No Time.
No Time.
No Time, yeah.
No Time. Okay, perfect. And William said, great stuff. Are you going to write another book on writing?
Oh, yes, it's already in the work. The next book I write is about the writing. It's a revision management process. So I will outline how you can author your story, how you can come up with your theme, with your story arc, with your rudimentary characterization and a rudimentary world setting. And if you have that all in place, you can then write your first draft, and then how you can move from one draft to another. And I will outline that because if you don't have a proper procedure, it's very chaotic, the writing process. And it took me a long time for myself to come up with a step-by-step procedure where I don't get distracted from what I'm actually trying to accomplish. So that will be the next book.
Yeah, and I love that topic because just like with writing a book, a lot of authors also get overwhelmed with rewrites and revisions and edits. So that's fantastic. He said hopes that soon. Do you have a expected release date for that book?
Actually, on my website, you can sign up for a free beta version of that book. You can download it for free and read it. And if you like, comment and help me to improve it before I publish it.
Fantastic. So again, Stefan's website is 8crafts.com. And thank you so much for joining us today. And for everyone watching, if you have not checked out Marlowe is our artificial intelligence that can read your manuscript and provide almost instant feedback on its plot structure, characters, pacing, and more. You can try out Marlowe for free at authors.ai or purchase her pro report, which is a fantastic report that I think will blow you away. So be sure to visit authors.ai to find out about Marlowe. Thank you for watching First Draft Friday with Stefan. Again, his website is 8crafts.com. And thank you so much for being here today. It's been fantastic. Thank you guys for joining in. And we will see you all in 2 weeks at the next First Draft Friday.